Policing wasn't implemented exactly as it looks today back in the 1700s. In fact, we have a democratic system of government renewal where every year new policies are passed, new measures are passed to change things. So I want people to remember that. There's this idea often that when people say, like, abolition is ridiculous, what exactly would the world look like? Well, we don't know. It's a process. We're always continually remaking our world.
The very public murder of George Floyd, a 46-year-old black man, by white Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin in May 2020 sparked global outrage and horror and led to a reckoning about the role of police not just in the United States, but around the world. The devastating image of Chauvin kneeling on the neck of Floyd for over 9 minutes caused many to question for the first time their relationship with policing. Throughout the spring and summer of 2020, millions of people across the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia took to the streets to demand an end to police brutality and call for greater police accountability and the adoption of comprehensive police reform. Some critics went further and called for the defunding of police and even their abolition. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. Every year, tens of billions of dollars are spent on policing in North America. In 2022-2023, the total operating expenditures for all police services in Canada were nearly $20 billion, an increase of 6% compared with the previous year. During that same period, the total police budget in the United States was nearly $250 billion. These huge investments in policing have caused some critics to ask some fundamental questions. What do police do? Whom are they for? Are they truly guardians of public safety? Are they protectors? Are they overlords? Are they a necessary force that regulates social behavior and helps maintain civility and the structural integrity of society? Or do they need to be replaced by entities that are better equipped to meet people's basic needs? For over a decade, Sandy Hudson has been challenging police power and trying to imagine ways to create safety and justice for more people. Sandy Hudson is a lawyer, writer, and activist, and the founder of Black Lives Matter Canada. She also co-founded the Black Legal Action Centre. She's the co-host of the podcast Sandy and Nora Talk Politics. Her new book is called Defund: Black Lives, Policing, and Safety for All. Sandy Hudson, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Sandy, I wanted to begin this way. I wanted to ask you your earliest memory of the police.
It's probably in grade school at an assembly at some point, likely being addressed by a police officer themselves, telling us how to contact the police or that they were the people to contact. I remember sitting in an assembly listening to a police officer say, "I'm the one to help you out if you ever need anything."
What was your understanding of the police growing up?
I mean, my impression of that moment probably was like the same sort of thing that most people likely come away with, which is just this idea that, all right, if I call 911 when I'm in trouble, I get a personal hero to show up and take care of my problems. That was the idea as a kid.
In your book, you use some pretty strong terms. You talk about policing as a scourge, policing as a curse. When did your views about the police perhaps start to change, or how did they evolve?
They evolved over time. I wasn't an abolitionist at birth, It takes some time. It's so ingrained in our society. And I think there's a few things that got me to start thinking a little bit more critically about police and policing. One memory that I have as a kid is, I lived in an apartment building, and there was a neighbor who was experiencing some sort of difficulty with her husband. I would probably describe it today as domestic violence. And there was a time when I remember I was going to school and getting into the elevator, and there was just all of this running coming out of her apartment and her husband going after her and her trying to get into the elevator with us to escape, and then us kids becoming a part of this situation. And I remember talking to people in the apartment building, my mother, about it later, and realizing that this was something that this woman had been dealing with for some time, and there was no personal hero to help her out. So that was one thing that got me I was just like, "Why doesn't she just call the police?" And it was like, "Oh, it's more complicated than that." So that was one thing that got me thinking as a kid. I was just like, "That's so strange," because that's not what you're told. And then I witnessed on television the Toronto Police Service executing a raid and realizing that my cousin was the subject of that raid while watching the news. And then talking to family members later about what that experience was like, what the police were looking for, what they found or didn't find, how terrorized and afraid my family members felt. It was pretty horrific. So those two experiences really started to turn my mind towards like, what is this really about? What do police really do here? And what have we been told versus what actually goes down?
Police abolition seems absurd and unfeasible to many people. I've heard you talk on other podcasts about how, for the Black community, for Indigenous communities, the idea of defunding the police is not a new one.
No, it's not. And I mean, it's not new for like any public service. There's always public services that seem to get the attention of politicians who wish to defund them. And, politicians will talk about tax cuts all the time, or cuts to education, or cuts to healthcare. There's very, very few services that escape the austerity agendas that politicians who have such agendas enter their terms with. But policing always does. And it's like, how did we get to the place where it's absurd to even discuss a reduction in budget, let alone a review of the entire service? Whereas, we have got teachers who are struggling to make ends meet as a service that's definitely essential. And we have no problem discussing more and more cuts to education. How did we get to this point?
Well, how did we get to this point? Because you talk in the book about the fact that in the early days of television, policing was vilified in the popular culture. It's certainly not vilified in 2025.
No, it's really not. And it's so interesting to go back into that history and recognize that, there was like a cultural feeling, the sentiment that policing was a problem, that policing was corrupt, that policing was more about social control than anything else. And certainly in the early days of television and movie making, police were not seen as a service to keep people safe at all. It was like no one would have thought that. It's a very interesting, deliberate sleight of hand that policing agencies undertook when they started working with producers and media makers and culture makers to try to shift how police were seen in the public, to ensure that they would maintain power in our societies. And this comes from a concerted effort by an international body of policing that still exists today in the early 1900s, discussing how they wanted to shift their perception in the UK, in the United States, in the UK's colonies, elsewhere. And that's when you start to see television shows, radio shows start to portray police as heroes. And in some cases, legislation is passed to prevent police and crime being portrayed in particular ways.
The Hays Codes, I think you call it.
That's right.
Mhm.
The Hays Code in the United States. You start to see films that venerate, for example, the RCMP in Canada. And the Hays Code in particular was really, really influential because it prevented the creation of media that would portray the police as duplicitous. And so you start to get media that no longer reflects the culture, but then shifts culture as well into getting people to believe that police are these personal heroes.
I suppose the TV program Dragnet was really a blockbuster hit.
The story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Was that the first example of Hollywood collaborating with the LAPD and other police forces to create programming, to create stories?
If not the first, certainly one of the first. And yeah, that collaboration is really, really important in the history of policing because what they did was to say, like, look, here we are in Hollywood. We need permits. We need security. It would be really great if the police provided that. And also, we're creating this police show. How can we get you to help us? And the police are like, well, we would love to have final say over your scripts. We would love to have a say in how you're portraying police in this police show. And so therein begins this incredible partnership where even J. Edgar Hoover of FBI fame gets involved in the curation of these scripts of how police are going to be portrayed. So even things as interesting as, like, you know, the LAPD did not have a very diverse force and were going after Black and Mexican communities with regularity. If you were watching Dragnet and the shows that came after it and its legacy shows, it seemed like a diverse force where they had Black police officers. And it was really a quite diverse place because they were trying to portray themselves as something different than what they really were.
And you highlight this relationship between Hollywood and policing because you think that these stories really help to shape public consciousness about police.
Oh, yeah. This idea that people have of defunding the police being absurd is because they have this belief that policing is attached to safety. And tons of studies, tons of data, stories, ethnographic research, anything that you could think of to get information about whether or not that is the case will prove that wrong. So how does something that is so absolutely incorrect become ingrained in the minds of most people when they're considering police? Well, it's because most people don't interact with police at all. That's number one. And two, most people feel like they know a lot about police because they have what they feel like is these stories that tell them what the police do, who the police are, and what they accomplish day to day.
And they're getting most of that information from TV, from movies?
Yeah, that's right. They're getting most of that information from television, movies, and the news. Those are the places where people create this myth of what the police are and what they do. And the people who really are harmed by that myth are Black people, Indigenous people, and other marginalized groups who have to bear the brunt of what the police really do.
And what you argue in the book is that police forces the world over have poured a lot of money into public relations, that they play a very active role in constructing a narrative around policing.
Oh, yeah. There's been some great researchers, and I believe a research project done by a paper in San Francisco that really investigated this. Turns out around the late 80s and early 90s, policing operations really started to invest in having communications wings. again, policing, much unlike any other service, has been allowed to grow and grow and grow nonstop, and they keep getting more and more funding. And that funding goes into really entrenching this institution in any way that it needs to entrench itself. And so if you think about what's happening at the late 80s and the early 90s, there's some pretty high-profile incidents of police brutality, police violence, and in particular, Black communities are rising up, getting frustrated about what's happening in their communities and talking about it more. So the police recognize that they have a problem. They're doing really great on the culture side with respect to television shows and movies, but they still need a way to try to influence the news and to have more and more power over how crime gets portrayed and how policing itself gets portrayed in the news. And so we start to see the proliferation of these communications wings of this public service that are really dedicated to trying to make police seem as wonderful, not harmful as possible.
So what don't people understand about policing? What is it exactly that police do?
Really, to boil it down, policing is a force that is centered on social control, to control people as much as possible. And that looks like all sorts of different things. How I try to describe it in the book is that they're really about the things that they were created to take care of. So that means colonization and controlling where certain people are and certain people aren't. It's about protecting the wealthy from people who don't have as much. So it's about protecting merchants and the holders of capital against the poor folks. And today that purpose certainly still exists, making sure that people who are marginalized or who are considered devalued in our society are controlled and never are able to rise up, to take power, to shift that circumstance. And it controls morality in our society. You know, we often think about morality policing as something that is foreign to where we live. Like we'll think about places like the Middle East or elsewhere, and when we talk about things like morality policing. But policing in the West has always, and up until today, been involved in morality policing, from policing how people express their sexuality to policing what substances they use. That's all moral policing.
Can you take us back to the roots of policing? You talk about the 1700s in Ireland as being the time when policing kind of really starts to emerge. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. This was one of the most interesting things that I uncovered while I was writing this book. I'm reading some of these really old materials that talk about what it was like when the first professional police force is created. And people were furious and people were frustrated and were saying, this is too expensive. They're so brutal and they're corrupt. It really felt like I was reading something that was written just a couple of years ago. It was just like, wow, this is from the 1700s. And so to take us back, people will locate like what's the first police in all sorts of different things. But where I locate it is in the first force that was uniformed, that was paid, that was armed, and that was implemented by government in order to try to implement some sort of social control. And what was happening in the late 1700s is that, one, the American Revolution, so the UK has lost its army. Well, not lost it, but they're off busy. They're distracted. But they need to control their first colony, Ireland. They need to control people on the land. They want to make sure they're expressing their religion in the way that the UK wants them to and not expressing religious beliefs that they don't want. England is also really wanting to control where people are able to go, what jobs they're able to do, and so on. And so they implement this armed police force in Ireland to control people. And it goes really well for the government. I mean, people were frustrated. People were horrified and angry. But the government is like, well, this could work in the colonies where we're trying to control Black people and Indigenous people. We got to export this over to the Caribbean. We got to export this over to North America and elsewhere all over the world. The beginnings of policing is about controlling a marginalized and a subjugated population and making sure that those who have power over them maintain power over them.
You say in the book that there's nothing about the RCMP to be proud of. Why is that?
I mean, I- it feels, from this side of writing the book, it feels like such an obvious question. I mean, we could even just take the last few decades of the RCMP's existence and all of the scandals and really horrendous stuff and be like, why would we be proud of an organization like that? Why would we continue to give money to an organization like that? Pick your scandals, the sexual violence scandals, the internal scandals that they've been having with respect to misogyny, whatever it is. Then you go back to the history of their creation. And of course, like I said, this policing in its modern form comes from what was created in Ireland and was trained by those folks and was instrumental in establishing the Northwest Mounted Police in Canada, which is the precursor to the RCMP. And what were they really tasked with? Well, they're tasked with controlling the Indigenous population and making sure that they could not just control, but remove the Indigenous population from their lands in order for colonizers to have a successful colonization of this place called Canada.
Yeah, you talk about their killing of thousands of sled dogs and also the role that they played on the prairies.
Yeah, it's really quite horrific if you think about the amount of violence that is inherent to policing, its history, but also its present. And it makes sense when you think about it, doesn't it? The tools of policing are just wielding violence. They are one of the only legitimate uses of violence, quote unquote, legitimate uses of violence that our government permits. And they are able to use violence to carry out whatever it is that the government is seeking. And so you get the RCMP of the past committing these atrocious acts that have a really horrendous effect on the ability for Indigenous people to live out their lives. And, for example, land back fights that are happening in places like Wet'suwet'en and the ways that the police have operated to use violence and to try to hide what they're doing from the public, not using those communications arms to transparently communicate with journalists, but actually to try to hide what they're doing and present themselves as blameless while they are actively harming people in completely undemocratic ways.
And yet your critics will say, Sandy Hudson, you are painting this wholly negative picture about the police, that police forces in various parts of this country, in Canada, play an important role in making communities, helping communities feel safe, feel secure, that they do particular jobs that have helped communities feel as if they are able to maintain a certain level of wellness in their community, a level of confidence that they can walk around their community without fear.
I mean, this is the myth part of it. It's like, what about what police actually do are making people feel safe? And are we actually creating a sense of safety, creating actual safety from the police engagement in that way or from the police being around? Are there other ways that we can do that? Because here's the thing. When people respond in that way, what I'm hearing is, the way that the police wield violence to make communities unsafe, and in particular Black communities, Indigenous communities, disabled people, that somehow doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that those people not only don't feel safe because of the police, but are made unsafe by the police. And then it gets me to question, is it the fact that these people are not safe and are being targeted by police that are making other communities feel safe. And if that's the case, then we have a broader cultural issue on our hands.
Well, they would say, when we call 911, we know that the police are going to come. And we have been helped in very, very, often difficult conditions by police officers who have been able to de-escalate situations, who have been able to apprehend people who are menaces in the community and who are terrorizing our communities, that these police officers play an integral role in keeping our communities healthy.
And again, this is just another one of the myths. The majority of what police do with their time has nothing to do with crime at all. It's very, very little police time is spent on criminal activities. So that's one thing.
So how are they spending their time?
Most of their time is spent on what's called calls for service. So people may call the police and ask for support or help finding something in the community, stuff that you don't really need someone to come with all of the tools to kill people for, like helping them get a cat down or something from a tree, stuff like that. It's spent patrolling, just walking around. It's spent on paperwork. Like most of what police are doing has nothing to do with crime. So we have to know that. The other thing is that most of the time when police do get involved with crime, very few of the cases that they're dealing with get resolved. When it comes to arson and robberies and burglaries, in Canada, it's something like less than 25% for all of those issues, and much less in most cases than a quarter. And I don't know of any public service that operates that poorly, that just continues to get more and more money each year as though that it's a foregone conclusion. And then we have issues like domestic violence and violence against women, where the police have next to no impact. What are we really talking about here when we're talking about what the police are doing? It's very, very rare that they are actually dealing with a case of violent crime. I talk about in the book an example of having this discussion with someone where I was like, have you ever called the police when you've experienced some sort of issue? Let's do a thought experiment. If you come home one day and you notice that there's been a robbery and you call the police, what do you think happens? It's well, the police show up. Okay, great. The police show up. And then what? Normally, what happens in that circumstance, you don't get your stuff back. The police don't resolve the issue. And you end up needing to call your insurance company to actually take care of the issue, which is how things get resolved. Some of your listeners have either dealt with or heard of the massive car theft issues that have been happening across the country that the police have not been able to resolve for people. It's just such an ineffective service. It's just boggles the mind how successful they've been at convincing people that this is the best that we've got to take care of the issues that we face in our communities.
Well, let me be a bit more specific. How effective are police at addressing gender-based violence?
Not effective at all. In fact, one of the things that I've been really surprised by in doing this work is that oftentimes women, gender-based violence or sexual violence will be brought up as the number one reason why I'm wrong. Well, what are you going to do about rape, or what are you going to do about gender-based violence? It's often the first thing that comes up. And it's really shocking because police are failing completely at supporting people who find themselves in a domestic violence situation, in a sexual violence situation, in a gender-based violence situation. Most incidents of gender-based violence, if we're talking about sexual violence, for example, are not reported to the police at all. And in part, that's because of the dangers that women in particular might find themselves in if they do report. and the difficulty that the system has set up around a report that a victim will have to go through. Our system isn't focused on making sure that victims are made whole or that victims are taken care of or have support. Our system is really focused on interrogating the victim to really see if what they're saying is correct, to the exclusion of really going after who might be a perpetrator. And in cases of domestic violence, it's really disheartening, in fact, that people experience so little support in our society, going through one of the most prevalent examples of the types of violence that people experience in our society. If we take a step back and think about, well, what does a woman or person trying to escape domestic violence really need? Oftentimes, they need resources like monetary support. They need a place to stay. They need a place where they can take their kids if they have them. None of these things police provide. And all of these things, the services that we have, to the meager services that we have to provide any of those things, if at all, are underfunded, overused, and strapped and require more resources. So what are we doing?
Sandy Hudson, you write, rather than doing the difficult work of dealing with the root causes of many of our social issues, throw tons of money at police. Rather than rooting out poverty, for example, we by and large make many behaviors associated with poverty criminal and subject poor people to a revolving door of surveillance, suspicion, interrogation, punishment, and banishment.
That's right. I mean, I think one of the greatest examples for this is the amount of policing that we're starting to see more and more in our public transportation services, which to me, again, is like, it just boggles the mind. You know, you have these fare inspectors and special constables for different types of transit, and, you know, you're interrogating and investigating, especially youth who may try to take public transportation without paying the fare. And full disclosure, I have been that youth. You know, I have been that kid who didn't have enough money but needed to get home or needed to get to work and figured out a way to get on transit. And what's happening there, right? You've got someone, thinking back to my youth, I'm trying to get to work or I'm trying to get to school. And I just don't have the cash on me to get there, but I still have to get there because the way this society is set up, I got to get there. You know, there's an expectation that I'm there or I'm going to get in trouble. So I figure out a way to get on the public transportation. But what have we done? We've made public transportation cost an amount of money that some people may think is nominal, but when you add it all up, it's a really large expense for people who are struggling. And if you're deciding between paying your bills and taking transit or eating that next meal, you know, it becomes a difficult thing to pay. And so for people who try to literally move themselves without paying the fare, what do? We spend money policing them instead of spending money making it possible for them to take transit without a fare at all. What if we were to eliminate the ability for that to be a crime, to be something that could be policed by spending that money that we're spending on policing and instead making transit free so that people can get to the places where we expect them to be? But we don't do that. Obviously, we're like, it's okay to spend as much money as we want on police, to cut money from public transit, to increase fares, and to have these videos that come out every once in a while of police officers beating on youth in our public transportation.
So what do you mean exactly, Sandy, when you say defund the police? Because, the first black president of the United States, Barack Obama, in an interview on Good Luck America, I think it was in 2020, famously dismissed the call to defund the police as a snappy slogan. He said what organizers like you really want are reforms, not police abolition. Is that true?
No, it's not true. And it's like, so disappointing that the Hope and Change president said this is just a snappy slogan, The Medicare for All president says this is just a snappy slogan. He knows what the power is of putting something like a complicated idea, not even complicated, but an idea into a pithy statement is. It's a very powerful thing to be able to do something like that. And he's done it so remarkably over the course of his political career. No, I'm not looking for reforms because one of the things that I look into and talk about in the book is the number of reforms that have been tried and tried again and tried again and that fail to address the issues that people say they care about when we talk about police brutality and the problems with policing. So what we know definitively after years and years and cycles of the same reforms being discussed is that reforms don't work. We just need to address these issues in different ways. And instead of believing that we can turn this institution that was expressly created to control people and the most marginalized and destitute and discriminated against people, we have to stop deluding ourselves into believing that we can transform that into some sort of purveyor of safety when it has most consistently shown that it is, in fact, a service that makes scores of people less safe.
So what would a future society without policing look like to you? Because for some people, that's a pretty dystopian idea, a world without police. They're going to say, who are the folks who are going to investigate the serial killers? Who are the folks who are going to investigate homicides? Who are the folks who are going to deal with behavior that is unbecoming in our communities, that causes people to feel unsafe? So what does that society without police look like?
One of the things that I say in the book, and I really do strongly believe this for any sort of policy or issue that we're dealing with in our society, is that we don't have to have all the answers right away. We just need to try to deal with what the issues are. I think that that is the case whether we're talking about AI or what's going on with climate change. We don't have to have the full sum total of exactly how it's going to look. And quite frankly, as we continue to shape and change and give more responsibility to police, policing wasn't implemented exactly as it looks today back in the 1700s. In fact, we have a democratic system of government renewal where every year new policies are passed, new measures are passed to change things. So I want people to remember that. There's this idea often that when people say, like abolition is ridiculous, what exactly would the world look like? Well, we don't know. It's a process. We're always continually remaking our world. But there are a few things that I think would be clear right off the bat. One is that I think we would have a society that focuses a lot more on the people who are harmed in a situation and making sure that they are safe, that they have what they need, that we're focused on trying to resolve how people have been harmed and not just focused on punishment, but focused on making sure that those people who've been harmed are okay, are able to live their lives. And then also taking a look at the people who have implemented harm and recognizing that, okay, we want to prevent this from happening again. So can we do a little bit more work to find out how we got to this place in the first place and how we can make sure that this never happens again? Currently, no one's really doing that. Doesn't that just seem obvious that we should want to prevent issues from happening again?
In 2020, in a conversation that you had with your friend and podcast co-host Nora Loretto, you declared victory, effectively saying that, quote, abolitionists had already won the campaign to eliminate policing. 5 years later, do you think you were naive and a little premature in your pronouncement?
That's a great question. I actually think about that a lot. And I yes and no. What I was talking about there and what we discussed on the podcast was how impossible it felt that we had gotten to this point where we could talk about police abolition in mainstream media and finally have people listen to us and change the perspective of the average person to finally get people to start thinking about these things. To me, that in and of itself is a victory because all of the information that got out there about how ineffective police are, about the amount of money that was going to policing, some of the horrible and horrifying things that police are permitted to do and do, that information, once you know it, you can't unknow it. And so to me, that's a significant victory.
And yet there has been a backlash, is there not, Sandy? And there has been pullback. We see, for example, like in 2020, after George Floyd, there was talk about, for example, removing police from schools. We know that there were police in schools in the Toronto District School Board, police in schools here in Ottawa. For a time, that was going to become verboten. And now it seems that those kinds of initiatives are actually coming back. In Minneapolis, they were talking about defunding the police. That no longer seems to be on the agenda.
In Minneapolis, they were talking about abolishing the police.
Abolishing the
That's right.
police, yeah.
Yeah, I would say, I knew that this was coming, this backlash moment, but I will say that the ferocity with which it has hit has definitely been really hard to accept because the decisions that are happening now to turn away from the problems of policing are happening in a context where people cannot claim ignorance. So you know that police are dangerous to be around kids.
And yet, your critics are going to say, Sandy Hudson, you have it all wrong. Like, you scared us. When you're talking about defunding the police and abolishing the police, we find that idea scary because we think that it's going to result in the demise of our communities. And it's going to result in our communities crumbling.
But what I mean, though, is the people who are making those decisions or who are talking about those decisions of taking police out of the schools, politicians, they're aware that police are dangerous to be around kids, hurt kids, and that police are dangerous to particular communities. What's happening is that they're making the decision to turn away from what the right thing to do is because it's easy to win a political campaign by demonizing already marginalized groups, demonizing people who are already on the fringes, demonizing crime and saying we need to do something about crime and just pointing to police as the thing to do about it. They're doing it because there's this another myth that somehow the loss of support that centrist and liberal organizations and politicians saw in the post-pandemic era had something to do with what these folks are calling identity politics, with the uprisings of 2020 and people wanting to turn away from dealing with issues of race because it is implicating some of these very same politicians and policymakers. It's easier to turn away from these issues. To resolve what is a problem in schools, for example, which is, not enough supportive adults being around to support kids, lots and lots of cuts to education that have happened, which means that there are less teachers per student. Each student is getting less attention than they ever have before. They're saying instead of resolving that problem takes years to resolve. It takes effort to resolve. It takes funding to resolve. It takes resources. It takes talking about making sure that you have a well-resourced education system. Or you can do an easy thing and be like, we're going to control these kids by putting police in the classroom, something that we know we don't need. Decades and decades of people did not have police in their classrooms. And now all of a sudden it's something that we quote unquote need. And politicians are turning away from resolving the issue of policing in classrooms, knowing that it's a problem when it comes to kids' safety. the more disheartening truth is that they just don't think that these people who are affected by this matter.
When you imagine a safe and secure community, what does that community look like to you?
Oh, it really looks like a community where people know each other, number one. I feel like, I've watched over the course of my life a situation where you used to know all of your neighbors, and now it's, like, do you even know your next door neighbor? I'm not sure. And where a government or what have you, whether it's, whether we're talking about a municipal government or a community council, whatever it is, the services that those bodies provide are really focused on what a community needs, where we're able to really take care of one another. My focus on abolition is not out of some strange, naive idea that people don't hurt one another or don't need support or don't experience breaches to their safety. But it is focused on knowing that for so many of us, the police do not provide what we need in those circumstances, and certainly are not attuned to trying to prevent those circumstances, those breaches in our safety and security from happening. I want us to all be involved in creating a situation where we are minimizing the possibility for harm to happen to us and our community members as much as possible.
Sandy Hudson, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a great discussion.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant, a production of Ricochet Media. Let us know what you think about our show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. The producer, editor, and sound engineer of In Bed with the Elephant is Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music, Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Kaloran. I'm Adrian Harewood. See you next time.